Hey, thanks to the Adam group, aptly named, from this past week for some excellent contributions, I think, to the discussion of the material, wrestling with the passage, the relationship between Adam and Jesus, how to understand the law, especially as Christians, and just some really good, I think, interaction with the podcast exposition of the passage, and some pastoral reflection, I think, that was also welcome and worth continuing to develop and extend. So I've read your responses to the forums for this week, and want to offer some response here in a few minutes of video to you. And I think that where I want to start is with the Adam question, how to understand this Adam figure. Yu Hui asks about what is at stake in the historicity of Adam. Should we understand Adam to be a historical figure in some sense? And Yu Hui, I think you rightly question any jump to that sort of conclusion in light of the genre of Genesis, which is not a sort of eyewitness historical account, or even an account that is in the recent memory of anyone. Instead, what Genesis is, and I think this does affect how we should understand Adam, is a retrospective kind of epic narrative or saga in which many generations of memory, of reflection, of wisdom, of learning are encapsulated poetically in a story of origin. And the frame for that, I think, goes something like this. In light of who we have discovered ourselves to be, how we have learned about how the world works and our part in it, how we have come to know the creator of the world in some measure. In light of that, what can we say? What sort of poetic story could we tell about how creation began, and especially how the human began? That's what I think Genesis is in the beginning part of it, especially. And so it's not incidental that Adam in Hebrew simply means human. And so I don't think that we should read it as a sort of eyewitness account where Paul is talking about Adam the same way that he might have talked about Apollos or somebody like that. But instead, Paul does assume, and I think this is actually something defensible, that the human began as a single person, and that all of the history of the human was in the seed of that life. And that life eventually became a coupled life, as we find in Genesis, and then extended across generations, finally to embrace us, but also the rest of the human, the entirety of the human. So Adam also names the way that the human is an intergenerational reality with a beginning whose ramifications sprawl across generations to include present and all future generations of the human as well. Now, Adam, in this passage, sort of like the law in some ways, and I say a little bit about that in the intro video for week 6, but the law and Adam, but Adam especially, is presented rather negatively, so that it's easy to construe Adam as simply what is wrong with all of us, or what is wrong with the world. And I think that that would be to overgeneralize from this passage, and to take what Paul says in one context with a very definite purpose and turn it into everything that Paul might say about Adam, which is just not the case, and nor is that the case about the law. So it is true that what is emphasized here is the contrast between Adam and Jesus, between disobedience and obedience, between transgression and the gift of life. But none of that should lead us to deny that Adam in Jewish tradition, and I talk about this in that optional article, One Adam Dying and Living, but that Adam was also conceived as a gift of God, as the Son of God, the direct heir of God, also as the basis whereby the entirety of the human is one. And Jewish rabbis of Paul's day and a little later used the figure of Adam to, you might say, respect the humanity of every person in judicial proceedings, so that because of what Scripture tells about Adam, the rabbis would say, in every human, as an heir of Adam, is the whole of Adam's life. And therefore, we have to treat every human as, you might say, in relation to all of the humans, so that we can't do to one human being what we would, anything other than what we would do to all of the human. So that's just to reinforce that Adam is not an entirely negative figure in Jewish tradition, or I think in Paul's teaching, but it is true that he is contrasted with Jesus in this section. And yet, as I said, and as several of you picked up on and commented on, I don't think that that contrast is one of diametric opposition, but instead one of redemption, so that Jesus comes into the inheritance of Adam's life with all of its gifts as well as its curses and difficulties. He digests the difficulty of that life and he makes life eternal out of it. So you all have heard me already expound on that in the podcast, but that I think also should qualify the way that we contrast Jesus and Adam. And Naran here, you talked about whether we can sort of think about Jesus as, I think you put the term that the completion of Adam or something like that. And I think that that's right. I think it's right to talk about Jesus as the fullness of Adam, the fullness of the human, and definitely not as the replacement of Adam. So lots of pastoral implications there that several of you have commented on that I think are important, and I might circle back to those as I call forth here a few other responses. Something else maybe that is worth mentioning from Stephen here, you emphasize, Stephen, that kind of image that I offered as an interpretation of what Paul is saying, that Jesus did not replace Adam, but carried Adam through death to life. And then you also commented on how much significance is added to that claim when we understand death and life in the more expansive terms of the law, or even the Genesis narrative of what happens to Adam. So I think that is a good highlight, and I hope you'll just continue, all of us, to reflect on the implications of the oneness of the human for the meaning and the power of Jesus and the nature of Christian witness. Amanda also talked about how significant this idea is of life not being an opposition to death, at least in any sort of neat way, but instead a way of digesting death. And there are ways in which life and death are, of course, opposed, but finally, as revealed in Jesus, God makes death the servant of life, or sometimes what I say, the food of life. And I think this is where, who was it that talked about this? Brian, I think you talked a little bit about the oneness of the human in this context, which was great. And then Winston about the fellowship table being a picture of how Jesus carries Adam to life. through death to life. And I think that that is right. But those pastoral implications are so important, you guys. We can have this wrong kind of triumphalism in our Christian spirituality that sort of regards us and as kind of straightforwardly overcomers of all evil and difficulty, which just turns out not to be true. As Christians, we don't escape death. We too, we decay and we die across the span of our lives, and we engage the other manifestations of death in our world, the estrangement between God and the human that is manifest in the estrangement between the human and land, if you remember, so that it's by the sweat of the human's brow, the difficult labor, that nourishment is brought forth from the earth. The estrangement between human and human, the first husband and wife, one dominating the other, the first two brothers, children of that couple, one killing the other, the hostility then that sort of pictures for us in peoples at war with one another and rivalry with each other. And then, of course, the estrangement between the human and the animal, predation as a characteristic feature of human and animal life. So all of these dimensions of death, Christians, we endure these. And what's important for our Christian life and witness and the nature of our faith is not some false claim to escape all of that, but the power to endure it and to follow the pattern of Jesus of making life out of death rather than pretending to avoid death. So, one example, especially for those of you in pastoral or chaplain ministry, is the way that we engage sickness. And even when it is time for people to finish their dying, this kind of picture of the human invites us to face that loss with our eyes open rather than running away from it, being a persistent presence, a loving comfort in the midst of those kinds of difficulties. That's how the power of life is made out of death, by facing that difficulty together. And do we seek cures? Absolutely. I think we do. But we don't think of simply postponing our death as the way that we're going to meet death. When we're able to postpone our death in certain ways, I think that that's good and to be embraced, but with the knowledge that we're finally trying to grow to embrace and digest death for all of what it brings to the human. And the way that we make life out of death is not simply by sort of rescuing people from that experience of death at the end. Obviously, we don't do that. It's not just the resurrection of their bodies in the future, which it obviously includes. It's how we make life out of their death for the generations of people and the community that inherits life from them. The way that we say goodbye to one another and face one another's weaknesses can be and is the food of the life that people will inherit from us. When we face the vulnerability of loss by simply going to war with those who threaten us, we leave a legacy of war to generations that are coming. But when we're able to engage those kinds of threats with a commitment to repair, to truthfulness, to confession of injustice, to sort of mutual accountability, rather than simply dominating those that we think threaten us, then we make life out of that deathly conflict, as opposed to simply reiterating death for future generations to have to try to engage. So hopefully you're getting the idea here of how life is made out of death. And we could talk about this in other, perhaps more even mundane contexts, like friendships, including the intense form of friendship of marriage. I think some of you mentioned this, where the way that we encounter vulnerability in intimate friendships and sometimes do harm to one another, but then learn to identify those harms. Charles, I think you talked about this, and to be honest about them and to work at repairing them together. That way of facing death in a relationship actually turns out to feed the life, the future of that relationship, when our trust and our love for one another is actually formed by the way that we have dealt with our sins against one another. So that hopefully is maybe clarifying the picture a little bit more, and you can see how this is going to spill out in the way that Winston talks about around the table, where instead of simply hiding our vulnerabilities or retreating from one another, we look for ways to negotiate our differences, to look for some healthy dynamics of mutuality that are mindful of power disparities, and look for ways to be together and enjoy being together and to enrich one another with the way that we share a table or share our life, as opposed to using the table as a policing mechanism or as a weapon of domination that sort of self-righteously elevates some, hypocritically too, at the expense of others. I think that here, what Marshall talks about is really important. And this kind of goes with what I was saying about Adam as an epic figure. The story of Adam is told in light of how subsequent generations find themselves committing Adam's transgression. And so it's not as if Adam's transgression sort of immediately gives all of us a legal status of sinner, or, some kind of genetic stain of sin. It's instead the fact that to be human is to be the heir of previous generations, to inherit both the blessings and the curses that previous generations leave to us. And so Adam's transgression is sort of like the way a river can be polluted. The people that drink that water, coming away from that and maybe even imitate the practices that they've learned from the figure who polluted that water, they're going to find themselves maintaining the pollution of that water rather than cleaning it. And that's the sense in which we find ourselves reiterating Adam's sin and participating in sin as a power by the way that we repeat in various ways the transgression of Adam. So that's kind of how I would think of that. And part of what Paul is at pains, I think, to express in this section is how the human, as it is made of flesh in the wake of Adam, as it is corruptible, this means that to be human is to be subject to powers that are greater than the human, and not only God, but other superhuman powers that shape our world and our life, including powers that we might think of as the powers of nature, but more than that. And that's what I think Paul is talking about there when in chapter 6, he says that he is talking about the human as slaves in human terms because of the weakness of our flesh. I don't think he's saying to people, you guys have a hard time understanding stuff, so I'm going to use a really kind of visceral analogy. I think what he's saying is quite straightforward, that to be human is to be subject, especially to be human as flesh. There is a kind of weakness that characterizes our condition of vulnerability that makes our bodies sites of conflict, competing interpretations, modes of either dominating or victimizing. And that's what it means to be flesh. And so in that sense, Paul is saying it's not actually a matter of choosing whether you're going to be a slave or not a slave. It's a matter of what you're going to be a slave to. And that's what transforms our behavior, is not us suddenly coming into some sort of neat autonomy and absolute self-mastery or self-governance, but to serve the power of freedom instead of serving the power of sin. That's to serve justice, to be a slave to God. That's how Paul characterizes our life as human beings in the flesh. So in this sense, also maybe loop back to what Naran has said. I think you're right, Naran, to say that given the power of sin in our fleshly existence, the law did not have the power to free us. It had the power to guide us, to show us the way of living well, to enable us to see that sometimes we can obey, to provide measures for us to be forgiven when we disobey, and in that way to express God's mercy and commitment to us, but not to liberate us from that slavery to the power of sin, because the law, along with these other things, continued to show that we were transgressors, and that even human beings without the law were sinning against God, even if they didn't have codified commandments to measure that sin. And so the work of God in Christ, especially through his death and resurrection, is to free us from that enslaving power of sin, and to free us for a life of pursuing justice that was otherwise not possible for us. And I think that, Naran, you ask about how this happens, and this is related to some other comments as well. I think that it does not happen simply by a mystical change of status or some kind of magic that happens on the inside of us, even though something does happen on the inside of us. This is where I talk about this also in the intro video for this coming week, because I think I neglected this in the podcast. This is where Paul's image of baptism is so important. The way that we are empowered to practice justice, the way that we experience freedom from the ruling power of sin, is in a life of community with one another. So that it's not just something we choose to do, it's the conditions of possibility of our life that we inherit by being incorporated into a community of discipleship. This is not a community that is ideal or a community that always gets it right. It still does commit sin, but it does not have to live under sin as a ruling power in the way that the human could not avoid without the work of Christ. And this is complex, I think, how this happens, but the sort of solidarity in sin that God has performed in Christ with us enables us to face sin without being ruled by it, and to face death without being captive to the fear of it. And that in and of itself is what empowers our righteousness, our just living with one another, which we practice partly through trial and error in that community of discipleship with each other. So that's how I think we're empowered by the Spirit, which is the power of resurrection, to carry out in our bodies, or to use the members of our body, as Paul says, as weapons of justice. We do that through community formation. And that also is psychological, it's internal at the same time that it is to do with what we might think of as the external relations of our body, some one with others. So I think that addresses what I wanted to say about Naran. And Marshall, you had a great word, I think, about slavery as the condition of the human. I think I've spoken to that a little bit. And so now I want to close with the subject that Charles and Tim were going back and forth on. And then I think Naran might have chimed in on as well, having to do with how to use the law. And I'll try to reply in that exchange in the forum, in Forum 2, actually, with some resources of mine that might illustrate what I'm about to say right now. So I think what I want to say, first of all, is that I do think that Paul is trying to teach people how to use the law when they are not under the law, as opposed to teaching people to pretend that they could leave the law behind. I don't think that fits Paul's teaching at all. He appeals to the law repeatedly in this letter, including as a guide for behavior. So the law is still in force, as it were, but our relationship to the law has changed because we don't live under the threat of its prescribed curses of death in the same way that we did before, because those curses have run their course in the body of Jesus and spilled out into resurrection life, and we're participating in that. Nevertheless, we do have to learn how to read the law by the Spirit, you might say. And I think that to make sense of this, we have to recognize, first of all, that we don't have a lot of good Christian resources for this, especially in the modern Protestant West, where just by habit and all kinds of questionable theological teaching and preaching and whatnot, we have grown to be very unfamiliar with the law and to think about it naively and to imagine that we understand what's in there. And in fact, we don't. We don't read it. We're not careful to try to obey it in any way that would give us a lot of insight. So our resources here come from farther back in the Christian past. There is I think some good resources in early Protestant thinking, but a lot more in the late medieval period. Someone like Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, others, Abelard, these are good figures for thinking through how to obey the law as Christians. Further back as well, obviously, apostolic fathers, patristic figures, early medieval figures, Augustine, and then after him. So those are, I think, some of the places we got to go. But then I'd also say that we really can use some influence here from the Jewish tradition, which shows us a lot, I think, about how to understand the law, not as a dead letter, but as a living word that requires ongoing revisionist interpretation in light of God's ongoing presence in leading the people generation after generation through time and space. So you can already see within the law itself this happening between Exodus and Deuteronomy. There are all kinds of revisions in Deuteronomy to commandments that had been given in Exodus in light of the new situation in which the people find themselves narratively in Deuteronomy, now entering the land. And of course, Deuteronomy probably being largely retrospective from a later generation as well. So the law gives itself as something that requires ongoing interpretation and reformulation. And that's something that I think has to continue for Christians. And even by another order of magnitude, you might say, since we take the eschaton, the fullness of God's future for the human to have been revealed in Jesus, and the light of that revelation now informing how we make sense of the law and how we obey it. So that means that I don't think we're trying to reproduce necessarily, Charles, the original context of when a particular law was written, why a rule came into existence. I don't think we should ignore that question, but I don't think that that in and of itself is what constitutes the force of the law. The law is always interpreted holistically by the rabbis. They are mindful of the host of inner tensions that in a very healthy way characterize the law. Laws purposefully bump up against one another because human beings have to make judgments and they have to take into account the right kinds of competing concerns if those judgments are going to be sound. So the law doesn't spare the human the need for that kind of interpretive judgment, but instead tries to shape the human with certain tensions and even commandments that bump into each other to guide human perception and judgment and memory and hope. So that's how I think we should be reading the law. This process of interpretation leads the rabbis of the early Jesus movement. So second century AD, to, for example, oppose the death penalty systematically. Now, the death penalty is prescribed in certain situations in the law quite clearly. You might remember the rather severe case of a son that is to be stoned when he disobeys his parents in a certain way. The rabbis don't simply extract that willy-nilly and say, yeah, so whenever we find a young man that dishonors his parents in this sort of way, we kill him. No, they're much more nuanced than that. They see what was driving the concern of that commandment. They weigh that against other commandments. They consider how God has been revealed as Israel has struggled under the weight of that commandment over time. And then they issue an interpretive judgment about how that commandment should be understood, which is that we have shed enough blood as a means of discipline in the history of our people. And that we need to learn now, in the wake of that bloodshed, the possibility of repair without resorting to the shedding of blood, without resorting to the death penalty. And we see now how easily that commandment has been the fuel for all kinds of escalating hostility rather than a path for repair. So I think that kind of engagement with the text of the law is something that serves as an example for us as Christians. And like I say, or like I've said a few minutes ago, I will post an example of me trying to do that with Leviticus. I think Leviticus came up, Charles, in your post, and then Tim, you responded to this. But Leviticus 18 to 20, specifically, my local church was doing a series on Leviticus, and then in another context, some adult education on human sexuality. Leave it to Presbyterians to have series on Leviticus. And so I preached a sermon on Leviticus 18 to 20. I gave an adult education class on that passage as well, to do with sexual health. And you can just use that as one crack at doing hermeneutically kind of the thing I've sort of just sketched out as how to engage the law. And just to maybe anticipate what I say there, especially as it bears upon some of our sexuality debates, I do think that going to that passage and lifting from it a sort of generic command against any conceivable same-sex intimacy or sexual relationship is not justified. I think that there are certain kinds of same-sex relationships in that context of Leviticus that are indeed being discouraged. And I do think that the sexual discipline of our behavior is an important biblical teaching and imperative that should not be minimized. But I think the tendency to extrapolate from that passage, which is so concerned with vulnerable bodies in an agrarian economy and the sorts of intergenerational households that included slaves that were part of that economy, that's the context in which male bodies are exploited often by more powerful males, in the same way that female bodies that are listed there and animal bodies that are listed there are exploited, especially by powerful males in that household order, who control often food production and provision. And so to draw from that some kind of generalized proscription or prohibition of any conceivable same-sex interaction, as if the concern there were merely the same gender or same sexual organs of the people involved in the sexual encounter, I think is just not sort of doing justice to the evident concerns of the passage. And that's not a matter of me being able to sort of reconstruct in detail the context of the domestic economy of the ancient Near East, although I do know something about that, and that's relevant. It's really more of a literary and exegetical kind of judgment that I'm making. I'm trying to read the text as carefully as I can in relation to other texts that deal with similar subjects, seeing how the list of prohibited sexual advances seems to fit together, what the narrative context of those prohibitions is. And that's how I'm arriving at interpretive judgments about how this law should guide us. And of course, I would want to add that interpreting it Christologically, we're not going to settle for a law that simply gives us what to do and what not to do. because as the law is fulfilled in Jesus, we see that the law, and Tim, you did a great job talking about this, is also about power dynamics, about measures of mercy and solidarity with the broken and those who are in sin. Hope that's helpful to you. Thanks again for your attention.